Hello everyone, I am Anubis.
And before anyone says it, yes, I know it's just a TV series, I know it's just a movie, I know it's not real, but it's just fun to nitpick and to come up with explanation for stuff like this, so I'm doing this purely for fun. So the topic of this video, in the episode Lost City in Stargate SG1, we had this scene of Daniel Jackson meeting Dr. Weir and telling her about how he used to come to this window to look at the Stargate when they were still trying to figure out how it works. And it's a continuity contradiction because in the movie, when he was working on the Stargate, he was trying to figure out the symbols, how to make the 7 symbols work and all of that. But he was doing all of that before he even knew about the Stargate, before he ever saw that. In fact, if you look at that scene of him figuring it out, explaining it to all the others, telling them how they need 7 symbols and why, and how the symbols are constellations, and only then they say show him the device, and only then the window opens and he looks at it, and immediately after that they go down and dial the gate. So when was this time frame in which you could have stared at it for hours while trying to figure it out? So it's an obvious mistake, an obvious contradiction with the movie, and it's not something that can be explained away as something which might have happened off screen, because there was literally no time in between before he saw the gate and once they activated it. So how can we explain this? So first of all, we can say maybe Daniel simply doesn't remember properly exactly those first few days, but that's too easy of an explanation, it's not really fun. So let's try to come up with more explanations. And by the way, we have another contradiction in this scene. He also says, basically implies it's the same place which he was working on in the movie, and yet it's not the same base. It was called differently in the movie. It also looked a lot different, both from outside and from inside. It didn't look like the same base. Now, in the first episode of SG1, we had O'Neill coming to this base and saying he was there before. So that implies it is the same place as in the movie. Maybe he was there on some other mission. So when Daniel Jackson says when he was there trying to figure out how the Stargate works, he would come and look at it for hours, so it wasn't even the same place. And he never did that in the movie. So how can we explain it? I think the most clever way to explain it is to say that maybe he meant that time after the first episode, but before the second one. Remember when it was said in the first episode that they could only dial Abydos because it was the closest planet, and all the other planets changed their positions because of the stellar drift, and they had no DHD on Earth, and usually the DHD is connected to all the other gates and it gets updated automatically, but they didn't do that, and so Carter had to do that with their supercomputer to calculate all the correct positions again of all the Stargates, and she said it will take a while to do that. So we can presume there was a little bit of a time jump after the pilot episode, the 2 first episodes, and the 3rd episode. Maybe it took them a while to get addresses before going to those planets. So maybe that's the time frame Daniel meant when he said he came here looking at the gate, when they were trying to figure out how to make it work. And he didn't say I, he said we. So maybe he meant Carter. Maybe Carter was working on those, updating those addresses, updating the gate, and during that time he came just to look at the gate from this window in this very same base. So this would make sense. So I think that's the best explanation. So he wasn't lying, his memory didn't trick him, and he was right literally that he was waiting a little while. Maybe it took a few days before Carter programmed the supercomputer to do that, to produce all the new addresses and to update the gate to be able to go to more planets. So I think that's the best explanation. There are of course a lot more contradictions between the original movie and the TV series. I talked about it in my review of the movie. Stargate Origins added even more problems. Most notably the fact that they could easily power up the gate and dial it with just a car battery and manual dialing, and it doesn't seem to fit with the movie because they showed how complicated it is to dial it. And even in the first episode of Stargate SG1, Carter said that it took the US government 15 years and 3 supercomputers to jerry-rig a dialing system for the gate. Now, this was also contradicted in the SG1 series as well. In many episodes they showed the gate in the past also being dialed with simple manual dialing, long before the so-called supercomputers and 15 years of work. And so this was a continuity problem even inside of the SG1 series itself. They showed that the gate was manually dialed in 1945 and then in 1969 when SG1 went back to the past. And so why did Carter say that it took them 15 years and 3 supercomputers to make the gate work? So let me now offer a possible explanation. Well, first of all, the last known successful dialing before the events of the movie was in 1969, and we know that SG1 had the Z guns with them, so I guess they might have used them off screen to help power the gate. We know that the gate can absorb almost any type of energy, so it's possible they simply shot the gate with the Z guns and then hooked up the truck to give the final electricity it needed to activate the wormhole. We didn't actually see it, but we can assume it happened off screen, so that's why I don't have a problem with that specific episode. And as for the dialing, they didn't dial Abydos, but it's possible they dialed another nearby system, and so the gate could still work. Just like in that episode in which they showed that they activated the gate in 1945, it was also to a close-by planet, which explains how it could work. And as for the dialing itself being so easy, the only explanation is that something in the gate must have broken after 1969, which is why they couldn't get it to work with normal manual dialing until they fixed the gate in those 15 years that Carter mentioned. And maybe it was actually because of that unusual time jump they did in 1969, maybe something inside the gate fried or short-circuited or something like that. Maybe after that incident it was impossible to dial the gate until they fixed it, which is maybe part of the reason why it took so long to make it work again. We can also use that to explain the events of the movie. I mean, in the movie it was kind of ridiculous that they needed Daniel Jackson simply to tell them what is the last symbol when they could have simply tried all the symbols one after the other. And in my review of that movie I said that one theory is that maybe they needed so much power to dial the gate even once, and maybe they had to charge the gate for a long time before they can initiate a dialing sequence. And it was also stated that Daniel Jackson did in a few days what they couldn't do for 2 years. So why did it take so long if they actually had the first 6 symbols from the cartouche? And we didn't see that Daniel determine what is the correct order to dial them or something like that. We didn't see that. We only saw him discover the 7th symbol. And so one theory I had was that maybe it took so much power to activate the gate that they had to charge it up for a long while, and maybe it took weeks or even months to power up the gate before they can try again, and that would explain why they didn't simply try all the symbols to get the last one right. Now this was obviously contradicted in the TV series, in which they showed that it doesn't take so long to power up the gate. We saw later in the TV series they can dial multiple times a day with no problem. Now maybe it's because something was wrong with the actual gate and they fixed it right before the movie, and so Daniel Jackson simply arrived at just the right time, and so his contribution was therefore minimal, since he was brought to the project just as the gate started working normally again. It's also possible that Jackson interpreted something in those texts he was studying to determine the correct order of alignment in the first 6 symbols, and so finding the 7th symbol was not the only thing he did, but we didn't really see it properly in the movie. He did say something about the correct order of alignment when he said he can make the gate work from the other side. There was a lot of things that kind of happened off screen in that movie for it to make sense. For example, the team that went to Abydos in the movie knew that they cannot just wait for the gate to be activated again from the other side to go back. So how could they know that if it's the first time they ever used the gate? So I assume that somewhere off screen they actually tried to get that probe back through the gate, through the open gate, and it didn't work. I'm guessing they sent more probes than what we saw in the movie, so basically there's a bunch of off-screen stuff that happened before they actually sent the team. So I'm guessing they actually tried to get one of the probes back and saw that it doesn't work like that, and that's how they knew the gate has to be activated from the other side. And in the first episode of SG1, Carter also explained that they did try to dial the gate hundreds of times before and it never worked. It only worked to Abydos because it was the closest planet, and so it wasn't affected as much by the stellar drift. And that's why it was still working, and they basically had to update the gate with the new coordinations in space of each of the symbols. And so that was a neat explanation to explain why didn't they just randomly open the gate if they could have tried it many times. And so Carter explained that the gate wasn't working until she updated it using that supercomputer she mentioned to make all the symbols work again. So I guess it's possible that in the movie the 7th symbol only worked once they updated its exact location in space through the supercomputer. So maybe before they knew it was the point of origin, they didn't know to do that. So after Daniel Jackson told them that the 7th symbol is not just a symbol, but in fact it's the point of origin, it's the exact location of Earth, maybe that's when they updated the gate through the supercomputer and updated that symbol specifically with the location of Earth. I guess by then they knew how the gate programming works using their supercomputers, and so maybe that's how he really solved the problem, not just giving them the exact symbol, but also telling them it's the point of origin, which allowed those computer technicians to actually program the location itself into the computer. And so that can also be used to explain that problem in the movie. And later, after Carter got the map on Abydos of all the other gate systems, she inputted that into the supercomputer to basically create some kind of algorithm for the computer to update all the addresses in the gate. And that's when the gate started working really properly and able to dial all the other gates. It was also explained that all the other gates in the network, because they had working DHDs, they all got updated automatically in relation to each other because they're all connected through some subspace network. And because the DHD wasn't connected to the gate that they have, that's why it wasn't working properly until they did it with the supercomputer. Another thing to consider is that there was actually a second gate on Earth which was connected to a DHD, so all incoming wormholes should have connected to it. And the only reason that the SG teams ended up in the same gate they left with is probably because the Antarctic gate was sealed by ice, and that's why it was inoperable until it got uncovered at some point in the series. And they even saw some frozen Jaffa bodies there, so that indicates that when it was open, the Gaul did try to send reconnaissance missions there. Some Jaffa maybe randomly dialed the gate and got to Earth, but because the DHD itself was still buried in ice, so that those Jaffa were not able to dial back, and so they got stuck there and died. By the way, I loved all the episodes with the second gate. I think it was a brilliant decision by the writers. It also solved a whole bunch of other problems with the series. For example, how come all the humans on other planets know the English language? If they all originally came from ancient Egypt, then how can they know English? But since we know that some humans were taken much later from Europe, I mean, on some planets we saw that there are Christians, which were taken from Europe in the Middle Ages, and so that explains how the English language could have spread in the galaxy. The funny thing is that before they knew about the second gate, how come no one was wondering why are all the humans speaking English all around the galaxy? So that was kind of ridiculous. They never said anything about having a universal translator on Stargate. So it was a bit ridiculous that suddenly all the alien planets knew English. But after the second gate was discovered, I think there was actually a line by Daniel Jackson that said that previously they thought that the fact that they encounter cultures which existed long after the time period in which the first gate was buried, that they had theories about parallel development, that the humans on other planets simply developed in a similar fashion to cultures on Earth. So maybe that's how they explained it previously, but then they knew about the second gate, which explains how come so many planets have cultures which existed long after the gate was buried in Egypt. And so I think it's neat how the second gate can actually fix a bunch of issues in this TV series and make it possible to explain away all those little silly stuff. What boggles the mind is that no one in Stargate Command was curious how come everyone knows English on other planets. They should have immediately realized there must have been a second gate at some later point in history. Jackson did mention something about it in the episode in which they discovered the second gate, and he said that previously they assumed there must have been some parallel development on other planets. Here's the exact quote: "How many Earth-based cultures have we encountered from periods both before and after we think the Stargate was buried? We've probably only scratched the surface. So far we've tried to account for these discrepancies with various theories of parallel or accelerated." Then he got cut out, and then Jackson says there must have been a second gate. And so I love how they use that to explain how come they can meet cultures from all across history and not just from ancient Egypt and before. And also the second gate was used in numerous plots in a lot of very good episodes, and so that was a really brilliant idea, I think. And by the way, the technobabble in Stargate SG1 was mostly very good, except that those small contradictions in the beginning. But most of the time it was very self-consistent, it was very cleverly done, very elaborate, and yet makes sense. Tell me what you think about all of this and we can discuss it in the comment section, and I will see you all next time. Bye bye.